What is this visit all about?
Well, as you heard the list from the report you had there, there's a lot of issues on the table right now for the US and Saudi Arabia. I think if we take it, scroll it back to a big picture issue, though, I think that the US is very concerned now to really engage with Saudi Arabia. They don't want to leave a vacuum in the region. And they want to be sure that the U.S. presence is there on these multitude of issues so that they don't let any other strategic competitors kind of gain ground. And here we're really thinking mostly about China as well. So I think that is in the backdrop of their now cooperation with Saudi Arabia, whether it be on Sudan, trying to resolve these problems in the region, in Yemen, or trying to bring Saudi Arabia closer to Israel.
You mentioned China. The U.S. did not object, at least publicly, to Beijing brokering that thaw in relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. This seems like such a different tack from a year ago.
No, I know it is kind of surprising. I agree with you. But I think on some level, the Biden administration specifically thinks that any sort of lowering of tensions can be a positive with Iran. And I think one of the main issues that the Biden administration has been focused on in its foreign policy is Yemen. And of course, this agreement, I think even for the Saudis, is very focused on keeping that important front with them quiet. So I think at least the Biden administration is willing to see the positives of that agreement. And as long as the Saudis aren't violating economic sanctions and these sorts of things, can take that as a win.
A year ago, again, there was the Americans complaining vocally when the Saudis led the charge to cut OPEC oil production. This time, barely a word spoken, shall we say. Of course, the price of oil is not the same, but is it also a way to try to do things on the quiet?
That could be the case. I do think that the oil price is critical, and the timing in the U.S. Of course, the timing before was both critical in terms of the U.S. political calendar, but also very critically looking towards the position of the sanctions that were going to be applied on Russia and wanting to lower their leverage. I think at this point, they don't want to create tensions on that issue as it isn't currently at the top of this very busy agenda. But I imagine that they're, moving forward, there's going to continue to be tension on oil markets. And the U.S. has shown a willingness, and other consumer countries have shown a willingness to use new tools to deal with that. Issues like strategic reserve or even price caps. So I think that'll be an ongoing story that we'll see moving forward.
Because last year, part of the calculus was, of course, trying to keep prices at the pump low in the U.S. where you are, but the other to try to squeeze Russia.
Exactly.
Is that just off the table, even discussing Russia?
Well, I don't think so. I think when we look at the larger global picture, that's probably issue number one for the U.S. In addition to the global competition with China.
But so I mean, in the discussions with Saudi Arabia is what I mean.
Right. I don't think it was a top level issue. I think the Saudis at this time, they had that meeting with President Zelensky, so they've shown a willingness to be helpful and to engage on that issue, and I think that's probably sufficient for the moment.
So yeah, the visit kicks off with talking on the press release says at least that they talked about human rights. There was a meeting with Saudi women this Wednesday. It feels a little bit like it's window dressing. Has Mohammed bin Salman changed since 2018 and the murder of Jamal Khashoggi?
Well, I mean, I think in 2018, he was very concerned with his domestic political situation and was willing to do whatever he had to do to honestly crush any opposition to that and even anyone willing to speak in opposition to him. I think now he's feeling more comfortable. But there are, definitely still issues on the table. I know that the family of Mohammed al-Qahtani, who's a very important figure in Saudi Arabia, who had formed a human rights organization, were very eager to get the Americans to speak on these issues. But I think probably with this fuller plate of things, it's definitely not going to be the top line issue for the Americans right now.
Kristin, Diwan, stay with us because there's a coincidence of the calendar here. The U.S. Secretary of State in Jeddah on the day Saudi Arabia bought its ticket into the North American sports market. The kingdom, which has started signing marquee stars like Cristiano Ronaldo for its domestic football league, now striking a shock deal with the Professional Golfers Association to merge its rival LIV Tour with the PGA. Leo McGuinn has more.
Teeing off into a new era. The golfing world was rocked on Tuesday as the PGA Tour announced a merger with the Saudi-backed LIV Golf. The agreement also includes the DP World Tour. The shock announcement comes after an acrimonious split in the game just over a year ago, which saw LIV lure several top golfers away from the PGA by offering huge sums of money. Six-time major champion Phil Mickelson was one of the first to defect. He signed a bumper contract reportedly worth upwards of $200 million in June of last year. Players such as Mickelson and former world number one Dustin Johnson were indefinitely suspended by the PGA Tour for playing in LIV events. They could now have a path to return. For those involved in forming the merger, there is no doubt that the time was right to do so.
There is no question, this united front has the potential to positively shape the future of golf.
How are you guys doing this evening?
LIV is bankrolled by Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund, which has led to many accusing the country of sports washing, the practice of using sports to improve a reputation tarnished by a dismal human rights record. Two players who stuck by the PGA Tour are Rory McIlroy and Tiger Woods, even though both were reportedly offered hundreds of millions of dollars to join LIV. Despite that, neither man was consulted before the merger was announced.
Obviously, Tiger and Rory's perspective is one that I understand very well, and it was part of my thinking throughout these conversations, and it will be a part of my thinking going forward. And now that we're in a framework agreement, I look forward to talking to all of our players, including the two of them.
The agreement puts an end to the pending litigation between the tours that would have gone to court next year.
Kristin, Diwan, I won't play you some of the tweets, bitter tweets of PGA players who were caught off guard by this agreement. What is it that Saudi Arabia is buying? Is it a vanity project or an investment here?
Well, it's probably a little bit of both. We know that Yasser Rumayyan, the head of the Public Investment Fund, is an avid golfer himself, and this definitely puts Saudi Arabia in the headlines, as you see again. I think Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, is himself very ambitious. He's put Saudi Arabia on a more global footing now, as opposed to its previous sort of Islamic orientation. And he really wants to put the country at the center of everything. And part of that everything means bringing investors and bringing visitors and actually long-term residents into the kingdom. And to do that, they really do need to change both the footing of the kingdom and also the image of the kingdom. And so stepping into really high net worth areas such as golf, extremely globally popular areas such as soccer, as we've seen, football in the Premier League and global soccer, is a very efficient way to go about that.
In the United States, what are the reactions where you are, particularly as the LIV Golf Tournament tour, is linked to Donald Trump?
Yeah. Well, I think there is a lot of shock just because the messaging, obviously, that was coming from the PGA was completely opposite to what the turnaround that they did. Also, the LIV enterprise didn't look like it was being that successful in and of itself. So I think there was a lot of shock within the broader golf world, and I think also just a lot of Americans are waking up to, wow, okay, this is the Saudis entering in a really big way, which they are in this sport, where they hadn't been before. So I think there's just a lot of surprise in that, and probably eyes opening to that the Saudis are in these arenas and probably are going to be staying.
The Sovereign Wealth Fund, which has its fingers in so many different pies in the United States, Ultimately, we could talk about relations waxing and waning between Riyadh and Washington, but are those the ties that bind?
It's an interesting question, right? I mean, because the Saudi-US relationship has always been a very elite relationship. I mean, I think it's fair to say that there's not a lot of love for Saudi Arabia amongst the general American public. Never really has been. And so that's a relationship that's been managed at the top. If you look at Saudi Arabia today, though, they have made a lot of efforts to try to reach beyond that. You can look from Mohammed bin Salman's first visit to the United States, where, he went to New York to visit financiers, but he also went, up to Harvard and tried to meet academic centers. He went to Silicon Valley. He went to Hollywood. So I think that just shows you where the Saudis want to play much more broadly. And that has to do as well with the diversification of their economy and how they feel they need to draw more people into the kingdom.
I want to thank you so much for joining us today, Kristin Diwan from Washington.
Thank you.